Good afternoon. I am Pastor Joseph Abrahamson, and I am pastor at Faith Lutheran Church in Clara City, Minnesota. I had been a teacher here at Bethany several years ago, and this afternoon I am presenting on ancient inscriptions in the biblical text. And the purpose of this is to help us understand not only how the alphabet developed, but the relationship that the Bible has with those ancient inscriptions and how the Bible was likely transcribed and handed down to us through the years. This presentation was made in conjunction with the Apologetics Committee from the ELS and also with the Bethany Institute for Biblical and Ecclesiastical Languages and the Bethany Lutheran College History Department for the Apologetics Conference this 2018. Now, most of us don't have the time or the resources to be able to evaluate all the different claims that are made against the Bible, and so we have to rely on people who actually pick up the books and pick up the things and study them to be able to summarize what's going on and tell us whether something has merit or whether it doesn't have merit. And so in this particular lecture, we're going to be looking at what we can learn about the history of writing and how it is relevant to the text of the Bible. So I want to start with a couple of questions. What's the oldest book of the Bible? Job could be, but is there anything in there that tells us the date? It's just really hard Hebrew. It's really hard Hebrew. As far as, and Job could be the oldest book of the Bible, but as far as ones that we have an ability to date when they were written, probably Exodus or Genesis. And I say Exodus first because there are some things in Genesis that are written in a way that assumes the people have already learned the law that was transcribed in Exodus. So, do you know anything about how the books of Genesis or Exodus would have been written? The kind of alphabets or the language? What kind of language do you think it would have been? Hebrew is most likely, yeah. Hebrew is most likely. So second question on this now. Do you know what the oldest transcription of a biblical text is? This is actually a little tiny silver scroll found in a place called Ketef Hinnom, which is the shoulder of the Hinnom Valley. This is the place that Jesus called Gehenna, where they would burn the trash and stuff, and it was used as a picture of hell. But in the 70s, an archaeologist, 1979, an archaeologist named Gabriel Barkai found in a little grave two little silver scrolls, and on the silver scrolls were transcribed several Bible passages, and including on one of them was the Aaronic benediction that we use at the end of our church services, the Lord bless you and keep you, etc. This dates probably from 650 BC down to somewhere near 587 BC. So does anybody know what the oldest manuscript of the Bible, that is, an actual intentional copy of the biblical text for the sake of copying it as biblical text for people to read? It's actually a Greek manuscript, comes from Egypt, and it dates to the 2nd century BC. So we've got a lot of different texts in the Bible that are ancient texts, but we don't have necessarily the manuscripts that go back. So when we're talking about what we know about how the Bible was transcribed, we're relying a lot upon archaeology. And there's a couple of things that we have to keep very separate in our minds here. First is, when we're looking at biblical chronology, that is, how long ago did Moses write Exodus and Genesis and such? We're going on the basis of how we understand the dates that are written down in the Bible. We call this biblical chronology. But there are some cases in there where there's reason that people can have to disagree on whether it's 50 years or 100 years or such difference between them. So biblical chronology, while we're very sure that it's a short period, we still have some places where we can't quite fit in exact dates or exact years. On the other hand, when we talk about the archaeological artifacts, we're talking about historical chronology. And there's a lot of slop room in this. And so what we're doing is we're making our best guess as to where archaeology and historical artifacts would fit in with what we know about the biblical record from biblical chronology. So if you find a king list, like they have king lists in ancient Egypt and in ancient Mesopotamia, they work to try to match these two things up from the different places. You find another king list, and we've got to rearrange these things, and you've got 100 years difference from what you previously thought. So secular chronology outside the Bible, is a messy, continuously revised thing. And it's not the basis for judging the truth of what the Bible says. So when I make these comparisons between these ancient manuscripts and when the Bible was written, I want us to realize that as far as we know from this history stuff, we're making our best guess as to the way that the biblical text was written. We're not saying this is definitely how it was written. Is that pretty clear to understand? Now, a second thing about archaeology, I'm going to come over here and write a little bit. Let's say that this circle represents everything that exists in the ground from the old past. So, this doesn't represent all of the old past. This is just the trash that they left behind. Of that, what we actually have found probably is like this. There's a lot we don't know. There's some that we do know. And of the stuff that's actually found and actually published, maybe like this. Okay, so there's a lot that's out there. There's some of which is found, and there's even less that's published. Now, if you take this little part that's published, and we're just going to talk about one kind of writing here, and this is the most ancient kind of writing that we know of, and it's called cuneiform. We'll look at some pictures in a little bit. If you take what's there and available in cuneiform, there are probably up to 2 million tablets available. No one person can know them all. So it's going to take several scholars to know just a little tiny dot of what's in there that's available that's already published. So when somebody says, we look at this text and we say the Bible can't be true because we know from this text, what are they missing out on? We have to be very careful about making claims about the past, either positively or negatively, because really we're very much in the dark about what actually happened, and we're just making our best guesses on this. So today when you read the Bible, this is basically what it looks like, okay? The two disciples heard him speak. They followed Jesus. Then Jesus turned, seeing them following, said to them, "What do you seek?" Now, look at this. You grew up with this kind of presentation. There are a lot of things that you take for granted when you read the biblical text here. Like, what's this? A verse number. The verse numbers, they didn't come into existence until the 12th century AD. Okay, that's when they first started coming into existence. What about this?
Quotation mark?
Yeah, a quotation mark. That's the 18th and 19th century AD. Okay. This versus this kind of letter.
The red letter?
Well, the red letter, yeah. Red letters were actually used in the BC times, but not for the same reason. They did use different colors of ink. But the capital in the lowercase, yeah, those didn't exist until the 9th century or so, 7th, 8th, and 9th century AD, during the time of Charlemagne and slightly after. And then we've got these little things right here. Spaces. And we'll talk a lot about those in a little bit. And then commas and periods and even, like parentheses and such. All of these things that are in our text that we use, we read, those things are there so that it's easier for us to understand the text when we don't know what the text is originally saying. There's a feature of language that people don't even realize that they have in their language when they're reading it. And that is, when they're reading their language, there's this ability to correct what you have seen. So, I say ancient writing was taught from one generation to the next. They did this to convey information. They wrote in their own languages. How many slides with this title were up here? There were two. There were two. Now, the reason that, and I'll show you the other one, okay? There are two reasons why a person might not have noticed this one. First is, I was talking and you didn't pay attention and it was up there just for a few seconds and such. There's a second reason though also, and that is our brains, for many of us, automatically correct what we're seeing so that we can actually read it. And so this linguistic resilience that we have allows us to understand what each other are saying, even though it might not be grammatical, or it might not be spelled correctly, or the words might be in the wrong order, or the sounds may have been difficult. And you know that cough was not part of the message. You know to separate the cough from the words. So this linguistic resilience is something that, as a feature of language, gives us a little bit of confidence in learning and understanding about how the people actually wrote. So we're going to start with the ancientest of the types of writings from Mesopotamia and Egypt. This is about 3000 BC down to 400 years after Christ that these writing styles were used. Mesopotamia is modern Iraq. And you can see here, this is 2100 BC, just before the period of Abraham, the Sumerian Empire. These people had a different kind of language from everybody around them, a unique thing, but they wrote in a style of writing that later on would become very popular. This is a clay tablet, and in here you can see there's a wedge-shaped triangle and a few wedges here and like this. This is called cuneiform. That's our modern name for it. It just means wedge-shaped. And they wrote it mostly on clay. We don't know if they wrote it on papyrus, because if they did, it didn't survive to us. That's part of this big space that we don't know about. What we can say is that they did write on clay, and that excuse that maybe people used when they were growing up, well, the dog destroyed my homework, take a look. So this particular tablet dates from about 2047 to 2030 BC. This is from the place that traditionally is understood to be where Abraham lived, and it's from the time just before Abraham lived as well. So this could be a person that was a king that Abraham would have recognized his name or known him, depending on the age of the person. Like I said, we have to be a little bit sloppy with the historical stuff that we find archaeologically. But this is the type of writing that was current in Abraham's time. As we look at it, it stayed very much the same all the way through to AD 400, but it was used for a lot of different kinds of languages. So you had Sumerian. They spoke something that was funny, different from everybody else. But there were the Akkadians. They spoke something that's very similar to Hebrew. And there were the Hittites. They spoke another kind of language. It was more Indo-European. And there were the Mitanni. And all these different people used this style of writing, these little wedge shapes in clay. This particular tablet that I have a drawing of here is from the time of the Judges, and that this writing style was used in communication from Mesopotamia down to Egypt with the pharaohs of Egypt at the time of the Judges. Okay, so cuneiform, when it's written down, transcribed, tends to look like this. This is with spaces in between. There's not usually spaces in the clay tablets as they're recorded by the ancients. And each of the symbols could be a syllable, could be an idea, it could be a word. And later on in a city called Ugarit, they also used these particular signs for particular letters of the alphabet, but not necessarily vowels. They would use them for consonants, mainly just consonants. Vowels are something that existed in the language as they were spoken, but they didn't really represent them in their writing yet at this point. And so we have this kind of a sound, and I'm going to ask you again to try to read through this out loud, see if you can do it.
In the beginning, God created.
Yeah, we have this whole struggle with trying to piece together which parts of what form which words when we're doing this, But if you know the language and you know how the syllables are supposed to be put together, you just simply read, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth," instead of "Inu da beginningu God created the heavens and the ruta." So, knowing the language and knowing how the symbols were used, despite how they were supposed to be used in the other language that the symbols were borrowed from, and this would be about, at the time of Abraham, how things would have been written down for Abraham and his family. This is a less familiar text, and it helps to demonstrate that as you're reading, familiarity with the text itself enables you to read the text better and more clearly. And this brings up this issue that is recorded for us in Deuteronomy chapter 6, where God requires literacy for his people, that God through Moses instructs his people to teach their children these words, recite them in the morning and in the evening when you sit down to eat, write them on your gateposts and on your doorposts, so that this literacy in God's word is commanded to be taught from generation to generation. And so now we're at the time of probably, historically maybe, pretty close to the time when Jacob's family goes into Egypt. Okay, so this is 400 years before the Exodus. So at that particular time, you've got a bunch of little different kingdoms. This lighter purple one is Babylonia. This up here is Assyria, also called Akkad, or the Akkadians, the Assyrians. And so Jacob moves his family to Egypt. And in Egypt, they come across a different type of symbols that function the same way, and there's 1,000 to 1,500, maybe more particular symbols. They're words, they're ideas, they're syllables, and in the case of Egypt, they already are in some cases used as particular sounds, like this little squiggle here. What does that remind you of?
Waves.
Waves, yeah. This is water, yeah. And in Egyptian, if this was used as a letter, it would be the sound N. In Hebrew, this was adopted, and because the Hebrew word for water starts with the letter M, you have a difference in how it's used. In Egyptian, in Hebrew, So those differences when they adopted that style of writing as an alphabetical writing. So here's an example of how we do use ideograms today, and people are probably familiar with maybe more than 500 of these just to be able to interpret and understand. The grapes of wrath, and this particular story of a bank robbery gone awry, gone bad. And then tell me what this is, if you can. This is more complex. This is a summary of a story.
There's a lot of death.
Yeah. French. Plot to Les Mis.
Yes, that's right. It's Les Mis. Les Miserables. Transcribed, this is sort of the emoji version of the Cliff Notes to Les Mis. So it is understandable. It is readable. You can figure it out. Now, you can't say that there's definite words for each of these things, but some of them are words. Some of them are ideas that are communicated. Some of them are communicated by repetition. A lot of people died. And you can translate that if you want to talk about it as translating, saying a lot of people died. That would be the words. So ideograms, syllables, and alphabets are not the same thing, but they do use the same symbols, overlapping symbols at times. And it was up to the people in Egypt, and it was up to the people in Mesopotamia from context to decide how each was to be interpreted. So now, from this time period, 1800 BC down to 950 BC, we're talking about the period of the sojourn in Egypt down to the Davidic kingdom, okay? Down to the time of King David and King Solomon. 1450 BC, people of Israel are coming out of Egypt. Moses is leading them. So what do we find archaeologically from this period? This is the style of writing. It's all over northern Egypt, which is called Lower Egypt because of elevation. The river's going into the Mediterranean Sea. And this type of writing is called Proto-Sinaitic when it's found in the Sinai Peninsula, or it's called Proto-Canaanite when it's found in the area of Canaan. But basically what we have here, this is the Egyptian shape of the head. This is an Egyptian shape for a house. Here we've got a person. Here we've got that squiggly water. Here, what's that? Cow head. Yeah. So that's actually the equivalent today of our letter A. That's where our letter A comes from. This squiggle here is the M. It's where our letter M comes from, the squiggles, like this. This head in ancient Semitic languages is either means rosh, which is head, or it's the letter R. So one of the big issues in interpreting these things, this is a graffiti. And the question is it an ideogram or is it a letter? Which way do we understand it? Well, this one, if it's a letter, it's RB, which would be chief or head of something. Rob, great. So interpreting these graffitis is kind of hard, but what's interesting about them is that they begin to appear, as far as we know archaeologically, at the same time period that Moses would have been in Midian, running around that area where these things appear. Now, like I say, this is having these two different sets of dates, one biblical and one from secular history. But it's a pretty big overlap as far as Moses is in this area. This is where this alphabet is being experimented with, played with by the people in the area where Moses is. Moses goes back to Egypt, and when they come out of Egypt, Moses is commanded to write. And so I would suggest to you that likely when Moses wrote Exodus, Genesis, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, it was likely in these kinds of characters. But notice there's no spaces between them, and some of them may have been used simply as letters, some of them may have been used as words or ideographs, which would mean that you would have to teach your kids to read that text specifically. So from 1300 BC, there's a development of something that it's astounding and it's different, and that's the development of an alphabet. One letter for one sound. The Egyptians had it, but it overlapped with the rest of their stuff. This is apart from any syllabary and apart from any ideograms, these big words. From the time, this is end of King David, beginning of King Solomon, we come across some of our first inscriptions. This is from Khirbet Qeiyafa. This is in the Valley of Elah. Does anybody remember what happened in the Valley of Elah in the Bible? Big event. Only a boy named David, only a little sling. Yeah, David and Goliath. And this is found in that valley, and it's from that time, as far as the archaeological date. And notice, these are the same kinds of letters that we found in the Proto-Sinaitic. They're a little bit different, they're more regular. There's lines between each of the lines to keep the lines separate, but no word spaces or anything like that, no punctuation. They're all the same, if you want to call capital or lowercase, they're all capital. You can see the letter M here. This is the ox head, the letter A. Same basic kinds of things in this this type of writing. This particular document, the interpretation is debated, not greatly, but it is debated because, again, we don't know if some of these signs are meant to be syllables or if they're meant to be ideas. But taken simply as letters, it says, "You shall not do it, but you shall worship God. Judge the slave and the widow, judge the orphan and the stranger, plead for the infant, plead for the poor and the widow, rehabilitate the poor at the hands of the king. Protect the poor and the slave, and support the stranger." It's kind of familiar. It's not the biblical text, but it parallels very closely some of the words of the prophets and also some of the words of the Psalms from David's time. So the little boy David writing his Psalms, the grown man David writing his Psalms, this alphabet we know is most likely from his period, his time, written on a piece of pottery in the same area where he was running around. So likely at David's time, I would suggest to you that this is the way the Bible was transcribed. Now, we've got a little bit of difference from the Proto-Sinaitic down to David's time. Things have changed a little bit. There's more use of simple letters, but still just consonants, no vowels. at the time of just after King Solomon died, he died in 930 BC, we find this in a place called Gezer. This is actually a calendar, and this is our first example that we know of what we can say is most likely ancient Hebrew or ancient Phoenician writing. It's too far south to say that it's definitely Phoenician, and its writing style overlaps so much from what we know of the Phoenician, it's hard to tell whether we got the Phoenician writing style moving south or the Semitic writing style moving north to Phoenicia. It's just too hard for us to tell based on the material that we have recovered. But this is a calendar. This is YRCH, that means the month, and then O, maybe plural, or 2 months. And this is ATSP, Atzif, of the barley harvest, the 2 months of the barley harvest. And then it goes on and it lists them. But in this calendar, this might be a word divider, it might not. There's just no other real word dividers in here. All the words blend together, and when you get to the end of the line here, this next word goes right over. There's no hyphens or anything like that. And then you've got, these two letters are run together in this. This is the big letter Shin, S-H. Here's that M laying on its side. And then down here you've got A-B-I. Abi could mean my dad. It could mean it belongs to a guy named Abi or whatever. But it's only about this big. It's on limestone. But at the time of King Solomon, this is the shape of the alphabet. And this particular style of alphabet, even though it might be neater, this might be a kid scratching or somebody who's learning how to write scratching. It might be somebody who's written for a long time and just is shaky on limestone. But this style of writing lasted all the way down to the time of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And even after, at the rebellion of Bar Kokhba in 135 AD, they were still using this style of writing in some religious texts. So these letters are known from that time all the way through the time of Jesus and after. If you were to read the Bible in that time, just saying that it's in English, and this is the same Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 and following, it would read like this. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God hovered upon the face of the waters. Are the vowels there? They're not written, but you have to know them to read it. See, one of the things that people run into when they see this, they say, oh, I can insert whatever vowels I want. No, you can't. You can't insert whatever vowels you want. The consonants are there, and they represent the full words. Now, there's a little bit of space for confusion sometimes in this. But remember that thing, linguistic resilience, that I talked about before? You grow up learning this and learning how to read and write like this. You're already automatically correcting for those kinds of errors, or many different kinds of errors as you're reading. In this whole area at this time, you've got, these are the Phoenicians right here, okay? And this is the land of Israel right here, the Dead Sea, the Sea of Galilee right here. Over here, you've got Assyria and Babylonia, and of course, down here, Egypt. It's very active. There's a lot of interchange of culture and of language that's taking place. In the north, that place in Phoenicia that's called Byblos, this is the kind of writing that was taking place. This is an inscription. It says, Aaron Ze Pa'al, and then Yip'al Ben Ahiram. These are word dividers. They're making sure that you can tell one word from another on this coffin, because they're expecting probably that the people who come after might not know one word from another, because there's nobody there to teach them the text, to keep them in the tradition. And so word dividers become much more common. From a little bit later in the same area, you have, what are the word dividers here now? Yeah, they're using dots. It's much more convenient, quicker, but it makes it very clear which letters belong to which words. So for then, in the 9th century and a little bit later, down to the 6th century, they started using some of the consonants occasionally as vowels just to help hint in case there might be some kind of obscurity in the words or ambiguity in the words. So 890 BC. This is, well, you can see the various regions that we have here. 890 BC, we have this particular inscription in the north of Israel, north of Capernaum, 36 miles north of Capernaum. This is actually Aramaic. But this is important for a couple of things. The Aramaic people speak a related language. Aramaic to Hebrew is kind of like Icelandic to Norwegian. Okay, there's different words, there's different grammar, but there's a large overlap between them, both in spelling and in the words and such. And so in here you've got the same dots, and one of the curious things in this is that you have this is B-Y-T, which is house, bait, and this is D-W-D, David. The house of David is mentioned in this inscription, which up until 1994, and still after this inscription was found, people were saying there was no such thing. That was made by people later. David didn't really exist. And now we've got an inscription from, 870 BC that mentions the house of David, which should not be a surprise because we already had an inscription, the Mesha stele, which is found in the late 1800s. This is Moabite. This is down by the Dead Sea and a little bit north and then further to the east at a place called Dibon. And in this particular inscription, it's about this big, and it's made of black basalt. And on it, King Mesha of Moab is talking about his battle with King Omri of the house of David. In this particular line, we have the DWD, and then H for his, or possessive. DWD. This little H here is the use of a vowel letter. It helps the Moabites understand which is the owner of something in that particular version of a Semitic language. And Moabite is a separate language like Swedish would be from Icelandic or Norwegian. Slightly different grammar constructions and slightly different vocabulary. 719 BC. Okay, so the Assyrian Empire is coming down. Prophet Isaiah is around, and he's preaching. His book is written at this time. And what do we find from about this time? This is the style of writing. So you have a much more fluid version. This is the same as that was on the Gezer calendar. It's still consonantal, but occasionally there are little vowel letters thrown in. These are like the letter W or the letter Y thrown in just to make sure that people know which way it's to be pronounced. Here you also have these are numbers. And this is the style of number that was used in the Egyptian hieratic script. So people in Samaria, which is, between Nazareth and Jerusalem, Jesus would walk between Samaria much later, but this is the style of writing that was current at the time of Isaiah, and, well, just before Isaiah in this case. This inscription dates from King Hezekiah's time and Isaiah. This was found in the Siloam Tunnel. This is actually a copy of it, but in the Turkish Museum, and you can sort of see the shape of the letters here and word dividers between the words. I'm going to give you a drawing of it here just to make it a little bit more clear. And in here, you can see it's nice and stylized. There's a consistent use of word dividers, and there's also a much more common, though there's no full vowel system, there's a much more common use of certain vowels to help people read and understand. So you're hearing me mention vowels over and over again, that there's more. You find it in the Aramaic, you find it in the Moabite, and now you're finding it in Hebrew, you're finding it up north, you're finding it down south. Why introduce these little vowel letters? Because people, maybe, they want to show people who don't know the text the right understanding of the text as they're writing this text from one generation to the next. So this is how it might look if you were to do it in English from that time period. It makes it a little bit easier to read. It's still kind of hard for us because, there's uppercase only. There's only one style of letter that's written there. But you can see where the words divide and such, and there's a little bit of hints here and there. 604 BC. This is right at Jeremiah's time and Ezekiel's time, and the Babylonian Empire is coming down hard on Jerusalem, and they're going to be surrounding it, and they installed their puppet king and such, and Daniel gets taken away up to Babylon along with the other special ones in the first part of the exile. This is where this Ketef hit him. This is the oldest recorded script of the Bible that we have. And in this, you have the benediction that Moses gave to Aaron to speak on the people of Israel. And again, it's only this big. It was found rolled up. It is actually found in the back of a skull. The burial style of the people was to lay the bodies out, and then after the bodies had decayed, to take the bones and put them into a box. Okay, so you've got this, and you've got 2 or 3 people in one box. The scrolls were on one or the other of the people. They fell down. Somebody's eye socket was up. The scrolls fell into the back of the eye socket and through and into the back of a skull. Recovery of this text was difficult because it is made of silver and it was fairly corroded, and it took a long time and special skill to unroll them so they could read, and hence all those different cracks as you look at it and see them. Also, just west of Jerusalem, in a city called Lachish at the time, you see this kind of writing, and more frequent use of vowel letters, but there's something else that's introduced here as well. You've got all one letter style. You do have some word dividers, but you've got spaces between words. The introduction of spaces. You ever get excited about spaces between words before? Here's one of our first examples of this. And what's interesting about this particular letter too, besides the way that it's written, is that in this particular letter, the person that's writing it says, "Don't you know, my Lord, I'm not illiterate. When have you ever sent a letter to me that I couldn't read? And I'm writing to you now." So he's talking about the fact that he can read and write in this particular letter, found on a piece of pottery in the city of Lachish from about the time of Jeremiah the prophet. And then also in the city of Arad in this early 6th century, again, same time period, this same style of writing. You still have these numbers that are done in the style of the Egyptian hieratic, but this is probably the way the biblical text would look at the time of Jeremiah, from Isaiah down to Jeremiah. Still no vowel points. You remember reading the vowel points, right? You know, the little specks and stuff underneath, you know, the hatef, patach, and all of those. Those didn't come into being until the 9th century AD to record how the church understood the text to be pronounced. So at the time of Jeremiah, this is probably how it would read. You'd need the kind of skill. You'd have to know the text. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. It makes it much easier. Yes, it does. It's still not all of the same conventions we're used to. So in this 5th stage of the development of writing, we have something else that takes place. And because of all of that stuff that we don't know, there are lots of battles and kings and such that we're still going to be learning about in the future. But the Babylonian Empire ruled a large area. Do you remember what replaced the Babylonian Empire?
Persian.
The Persians. Yes, the Persians and the Medes. And the thing about the Persians and the Medes is that they used the language that's called Aramaic, and they used cuneiform. This is actually a drawing of a letter that a Jew wrote to describe what was going on in household tasks, using cuneiform at the time. So this is, 5th century BC that this writing took place, that a Jew was writing in cuneiform, but in Aramaic and not in Hebrew. Nebuchadnezzar, some people had said Nebuchadnezzar didn't exist, therefore the Bible's bad and it doesn't tell the truth. And then we found inscriptions with Nebuchadnezzar on. In the background is one of those inscriptions with his name on it, okay, and his face. The inscription is written like this, and one of the difficulties in this is, wow, you read in the Bible, it says Nebuchadnezzar in one place and it says Nebuchadrezzar in another place. It can't both be right, can it? Well, how many different ways does the Hebrew name Yaakov come into English? Jacob, James, Jake, You know, there's lots of different ways. You can go into Spanish, Tico, Diego, all these different ways. All this is a matter of how you transcribe one language into another. It's not a contradiction or a problem in the text at all. So learning how they read and wrote, learning how they communicated helps us to understand also things that we might think are problems or people might argue are problems with the biblical text, but actually are not. And there you have the Persians and the Medes. They take over everything. And you've got Cyrus the Great, and he allows the people to come back to the Holy Land and to start rebuilding. And in this, he writes, and if you read in Ezra and Nehemiah, you'll find some Aramaic letters. In English, you read them in the English Bibles, there'll usually be a note that says, written in Aramaic, you know, for those particular letters. But they still use cuneiform. Down in Egypt, this is a little bit further south, at an island called Elephantine, they were using these square letters. These square letters are borrowed from the period of the Medes and the Persians as the Aramaic alphabet developed apart from cuneiform. It's related to the Old Hebrew alphabet, the old Phoenician alphabet. But you can already see, for those of you who can read Hebrew, you can already see some of the letter shapes are pretty close to, like this is a het, you know, and such, and noon, and on. They're similar to what you have in the Hebrew Bible today. So they use spacing, they use some vowel letters, and it makes the text easier to read. As you can see, just going through the same passage again. But then Alexander happened. Where was Alexander from?
Greece.
Yeah, north of Greece, actually. Macedonia. Yeah, Macedonia. His dad was Philip, and so there's all these country called Philippi, and there's all these cities called Philippi and cities called Alexandria, all over the ancient Near East and further east and stuff. The consequences of Alexander is that Macedonian writing style and Macedonian Greek was used all the way across north of India, into Turkmen and into China, all the way down into Egypt and southern Egypt as well. And so that whole Macedonian Empire, you know, it's not that these other peoples ceased to exist. Aramaic was still used. The cuneiform was still used. All these other writing styles were still used. But this became the official correspondence required across the land. And so when we look at Macedonia, just before Alexander sprung on the scene, we actually have a manuscript from Macedonia that you can you make out this word?
Ge, e, e.
Yeah, it's either Geya or Gene. Yeah. And so, and it's got there's a sigma there, so Genes thigh, he became. So this, you can read this, all right? Now, there's no spaces. There is this little thing here. And there's some more of the manuscript that suggests that this was actually used throughout the manuscript. This stands beside the writing. And in Greek, when you want to say beside the writing, the term that you use is paragraphos. This is a paragraph. Now, it's not exactly identical to how we define paragraphs today in English and such, but this is where the practice comes from of dividing sections of your text into sense sections. The ancient cuneiform writers did this sort of thing as well, but it wasn't quite the same. There's no word divisions, no punctuation, one style of letter, and occasionally there's an identifiable paragraph. So in Greek, it looks in one way like we've taken a step backward compared to the Hebrew. They've got all the vowels, but there's no spaces. Okay, so you'd read it in Greek, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Okay, you know. So there's a trade-off a little between the two as you're doing this. This Papyrus Berlinensis 9875 has something. This is that paragraphos, okay? This right here, kind of a bird sitting on a man. This particular structure shows us that we're at the end of a book. It's called a Coronis. And this style of writing, from this time in BC, this is pre-Ptolemaic, before Alexander died. This style of writing stayed the same until the 4th century AD in Egypt, when Codex Sinaiticus, Codex Alexandrinus, all of those were written. Okay, so it's the same scribal habits. You can make out this word. Yeah, Allah, except or but, yes. No spaces between, and that's exactly how these ancient manuscripts of the New Testament were written down. The same writing style. The writing style was very conservative. It didn't change very much. There are things that are added, but they're not added to change the writing style. They're added to help the reader understand the meaning. So a little bit later, during Ptolemaic Egypt, you can see that there are some spaces that are added. They're not added necessarily between words, but maybe at the heads of sentences, possibly. There's no period or exclamation point or question mark at this time. That comes a little bit later. But there seems to be some spacing that's used in Greek for sentences or in addition to paragraphs. At the same time, down by the Dead Sea, for those of you who've studied Hebrew, this is, except for the vowel points, this is the same thing that you find in the biblical text today. Okay? So you've got the same letters, you've got space. This is lamed, vav, aleph, lo, not. Okay? And so t, tav, vav, aleph, kaf, lamed, lo, tochel, don't eat. Basar, the flesh of shore, the calf, the uz, the goat. Oops, we forgot the sheep, the lamb. So they made corrections in the text. But there is definite, there's spaces, there's occasional paragraphing and indentation. This is really, if you read Hebrew, this is totally legible today from 150 or so BC at the Dead Seas. This would be the way that the Hebrew at that time would appear. So it's easier to make sense of. The arrangement of the text on the page is done to help you understand the letters that are still there. And all the way through this, the letters haven't changed, the meaning hasn't changed at all. It's the way that things are written down to help preserve what the letters say, what the letters mean. And then you've got AD 33, big event, Jesus Christ crucified and risen and ascended. And you've got the Parthian Empire and the Roman Empire coming in. The Parthians are one of the last empires to use cuneiform. When they pass away, cuneiform passes out of knowledge. The Roman Empire is using an alphabet that's derived from the Greek, and a little bit from Etruscan, but mostly from the Greek, which is derived from ancient Semitic, like Phoenician. And there's a new invention. Yeah, you've got this invented. Previously, it was scrolls. And the scrolls, you'd have to sew these pieces of leather from end to end, roll them up and such. This particular format for writing, the main message that was carried in this format for writing is the New Testament and the Old Testament. It's like this came on the stage for the sake of the preservation of the script of the scriptures. Like the alphabet came on the stage at the time of Moses, basically for the sake of the preservation of the text of the scriptures itself, to make it easier for the people to read it and to teach their kids. And so here's one of our older manuscripts, and you can see that it's almost identical in format and stuff to those from 300 years before in Egypt. But it's a little bit easier for you to read, I think. I'm going to zip forward a little bit here. Constantine, Edict of Milan, legalized Christianity. All of the manuscripts before that time were done illegally, basically. Christianity was a suppressed religion. It wasn't recognized by law. Now that Christianity is legalized, hey, we can copy this and we don't have to fear persecution. And so the Eastern Roman Empire, it's pushing up against this other empire from the East, where there are also Christians. But notice here, this is Codex Sinaiticus. Remember the Coronis and the Paragraphus from, almost 600 years previous, 500 years previous? Same writing style, same type of letters and such, just better preserved manuscripts. These conventions carried through. This also is Codex Sinaiticus, and I said, red letter edition. Okay, so we've got red letters here. We've got the paragraphos here. We've got a number here. This is the letter gamma, and it means number 3. In these, we've got indenting and stuff to help people follow what parts of the text belong together. There's still no real punctuation. There's no uppercase, lowercase, and if you notice, there's no spaces between the words. 643 AD, Islam conquers all. And over in the West, in Europe, in response, grows up what's called the Frankish Empire. Today we say the French. And out of the Frankish Empire came a very important revolution. A guy named Pepin was crowned king, and his son or successor, Charlemagne, was able to unify most of Europe under the Holy Roman Empire at that time. So you had a Roman Empire here. This was the successor to the Roman Empire. This had fallen apart, but now this Frankish Empire becomes the new Holy Roman Empire under the Pope. And what that meant is that you have this style of writing. Now, for those who read the Greek New Testament, this is very familiar. You've got uppercase and lowercase. You've got spaces. You've got breathing marks. You've got accents. You've got semicolons, and you've got question marks, which, it's different in Greek than it is in English, but they're there. They're written. This is still done by hand. There's no printing yet, no printing press. But this is where we get a lot of our modern conventions, even for English today, Spanish, German, French, all of these different languages come from this Carolingian Renaissance in the 8th century and on. At about the same time, Hebrew develops the idea, you know what, we better put these vowels down around the consonants so people don't forget. They want to preserve the vowel sounds as well as the consonants. Now, this is pretty tightly written, but the words still do have spaces between them, in this particular Hebrew writing. This uses the square Aramaic script that you saw from Elephantine and the Dead Sea Scrolls. And there are special forms of letters for the ends of words, so you can tell when a word ends and another word begins. But vowel pointing comes into use in Hebrew at this time. So we've gone from the time of Abraham up to the 9th century AD. What we've looked at is the way that languages in which the Bible was written were written at the various times that we have evidence from the ancient world. And as I said, we do one part on biblical chronology saying, here's when Isaiah lived, here's when Moses lived, here's when Abraham lived. And we do the other on the basis of secular chronology saying, well, we found this piece of stuff in the earth, and we think it dates to this period because it mentions this king and such and such. There is some flexibility or maybe some allowance for maybe this date is going to change or something. And that doesn't mean that the Bible is wrong. What it means is that our secular history understanding is feeble. But you can see, I think, in this various ways in which God, through time, helped us develop language so that it is easier for the person who doesn't know what the biblical text says to make out and understand what the text has and is written and what it means. Thank you. So if there are questions.
much. I think I have a question, but I need to formulate it here first.
Yes.
So I remember hearing about sort of a grammatical revision in especially the Pentateuch and Joshua, and I think it referred to around 900 BC, the addition of some vowel letters that are really sort of consonants, Aleph and Yud.
Right, yeah.
But presumably then, it wasn't just Proto-Hebrew that Moses would have been writing in. That what you're saying is the biblical text was sort of being not translated, but changing with the language as it went.
Well, the text wasn't changing. I want to try to define a couple of things here. Okay, first is the text as what God inspired and stuff is not changing. What's changing is the way that people transcribe it from one generation to the next. So if you go back 150 years and you read a Bible from that time, you're not going to find any quotation marks. You're not going to find a lot of the marks that you're used to are the same kind of paragraphing at all. It's still the same message. So the way that we change through time how we write things down to be sure that people can understand what is meant doesn't change the message or the text itself, but it does change the way we present the text to people. And I would suggest to you that the use of these vowel points and such, and the use of this sof pasuk in Hebrew, or the atnach and the meteg, the use of the semicolon in Greek for a question mark, or the raised dot for the semicolon, and such as you go on. Those represent not changes in the text, but they represent an adaptation of the way the text is presented to help the reader understand the text better, like adding footnotes and stuff within the text.
And a follow-up question or comment that I find interesting is, right, we would say that maybe the Hebrew text grew closer to what we're used to. It has these vowels that we can determine how to pronounce it. But that modern Israelis, for example, don't use, obviously, the points. For them it sort of gets in the way, and so they'll just have the consonants. Mm-hmm. So also I think it's interesting, and I appreciate the presentation where it came across that the meaning is staying the same, and that as these languages move along, it becomes easier for us to read, but it doesn't necessarily mean the language is becoming more advanced or
right.
complex in that sense. Mm-hmm. That we think that having consonants and vowels lined up is sort of the most advanced way. Well, it's the easiest way for us to read, but I appreciate your emphasis that the presentation is changing, obviously not the meaning.
Right. Yeah, and I would say also suggest not even the text itself, because when you go back to that Ketef Hinnom inscription, the silver scroll that was found in Ketef Hinnom, and you go back to the text in the Bible, it's the same text. Mm-hmm. It's just that it's just the consonants. There's no vowels. It's just the consonants. But it's still the same text. So we've got a couple of extra letters that are thrown in to symbolize vowels in that text in our edition of the Hebrew Bible. And we've got all kinds of vowel points, and we've got the sof patuk, the saluk, and all of these different symbols that are there, and the cantillation marks, and the vowel points that are there to secure the reading. But the basic text is still the same from one to the other for, what is that? That's 2,600, 700 years. The exact same text.
Something that I think I remember hearing you talk about at another point was the difference in, like, we have Greek, the Septuagint, mm-hmm. and then we have Greek translations of what was before, and then we have Hebrew, and then that there's some difference in terms of timing on some of the Hebrew stuff.
Okay, I'm going to have to draw this on the board here. There's a couple of issues. First is, because paragraphing is something that you do to try to represent the text, and it differs from one language to the next. When you translate from English to French, you're not going to use the same sentence structure necessarily, but French and English have 40,000 words that overlap with each other. They're slightly different in meaning, but it makes the vocabulary very easy for an English speaker to learn in French. But the use of reflexive pronouns and stuff is different, and the word position in the sentence is going to be different from one language to the other. And French is I'd say more inflected with conjugations of verbs and stuff than English is. So you go from that language and English, okay, and you're going to have different sentence structure, and you're going to have, in some cases, even different paragraph structure and arrangement. True also with Hebrew to Greek in the Old Testament. There are going to be times when you need to have a different word order in the sentence, even though Greek is a highly marked language as far as its nouns and as far as its verbs. You know, you have a marking for every possible case in Greek for their nouns, and so many different possibilities for the conjugations that some people make the mistake of thinking that word order in Greek doesn't matter, but it does. Word order in Greek does matter. Whether or not you have a prepositional phrase before or after a nominal phrase and all of that. Now, I know I'm speaking like grammatical gibberish at this point, but I want to, since they are different languages, you'll have to say things in a different order to say the same thing from one language to the next. So there will be paragraphs that are arranged differently from one language to the next. And because of sinful human nature, we will also misunderstand and make copying errors from one generation to the next that can be brought in there. But the cumulative effect of those copying errors is pretty much insignificant as far as understanding the meaning of the text and their accuracy. Is that getting at what part of what you were saying?
No, I wasn't very clear. No, I was curious about like the timing of when manuscripts, when manuscripts were found.
Okay, when they were found or when they were written?
Maybe both.
Okay, so Hebrew manuscripts, up until the time of the late 1800s, the Hebrew manuscripts that we knew about all dated from the Middle Ages. And in the 1800s, secular scholars were mocking about this and said, well, you know, the Bible didn't exist before such and such. And they would pick a time based on their historical theory and just, you know, kind of make fun. Then the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Nag Hammadi codices actually first, and then the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, and like, wow, these texts take us back another 1,000 years. And it's the same text. You read through Isaiah, and it's the same that we have today. Now, there's two copies of Isaiah, and one is different than the Hebrew text today, but it's, you know, it's almost identical to the Septuagint text that we have today. Like, maybe in that case, the people that copied the Septuagint had in their church a reading order for the text for particular Saturdays that was different from the church, this other synagogue that gathered together, or church that gathered together. Sometimes the readings differ between them simply because of liturgical cycle, both in the Old Testament, you know, at the time of Jesus, and in the New Testament. The earliest manuscript of the Bible that we have that's copied as a manuscript is actually Greek. It's from Ptolemaic Egypt, and in the copying of the translation of the Hebrew into Greek, it's supposedly done under Ptolemy II, that these 70 scribes got together and they all translated, and the all came out with exactly the same text. It's a miracle. Look, we've got the same text, therefore this is the inspired Greek Old Testament. Okay, that, you know, I mean, it could have happened. And I'm showing my own skepticism toward a couple of sources, ancient sources on this. But nonetheless, the Septuagint is what is quoted by Christ and by Paul in the New Testament. It's recited as authoritative, as the Word of God. And so when I look at the Greek Old Testament and in the Septuagint, I have to take it at the same level of authority that I do with the Hebrew Old Testament. There are some differences, like in the genealogies, like there's an extra name that's mentioned in the Septuagint for the genealogy up to Christ. That's not in the Hebrew, but it is in the Greek Old Testament. But it is also in the New Testament. So I'm gonna go by what the New Testament says. The oldest Hebrew manuscripts are in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And recently, there was a manuscript of Leviticus that was discovered. It was discovered a while ago, but it wasn't able to be read because it was charred, and it was in a little curled up scroll, and it was charred. And they used this, like magnetic resonance imaging, something similar to that. They didn't unroll the scroll. What they did is they imaged the scroll as it was, and they unrolled it digitally and it was a text of Leviticus. And if I remember correctly, it dated from the 4th century AD, which puts it back further than any of the manuscripts that we have from the Middle Ages, and it puts it between the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it's the same text. The same text is relayed between those. Now, I still don't know if I actually answered your question.
No, I think that you did get at that, because of like when you think of Hebrew's the language of the people. We think I think of that as like, oh, that's the language of like the Israelites and all these people. But then the Hebrew texts that we have not being as old as the Greek ones.
Right.
And what are the implications of that?
Yeah, the Hebrew people, when they went into exile, they used Aramaic, they used Hebrew, they used Greek, they used whatever language of the people that was hosting them, to use a nice term, when they were exiles. And they also tried to preserve the Hebrew and keep the Hebrew. And so by the time you get to the Dead Sea Scrolls, you've got texts written in Aramaic and Greek and in Hebrew. All of those. And the Hebrew texts are written both in Aramaic script and in Old Hebrew script, the Paleo-Hebrew script as well. So both of those exist side by side, preserved.
I just wonder too, I think perhaps, and correct me if I'm wrong, one thing that I've gotten out of looking at the Dead Sea Scrolls was it not only showed that we had old manuscripts, but that the manuscripts from the year 1000 virtually agreed completely with the manuscripts from the time of Christ, so that you would presume that the same kind of scribal care was taken in the time before that. Whether or not the oldest manuscript of the Bible is in Hebrew, I think that the Dead Sea Scrolls show at least that the Hebrew Bible we then would extrapolate, which is sometimes dangerous to do, past.
Yeah, and that's the advantage of that little silver scroll at Ketef Hinnom. Okay, that takes us back to 650 BC, but for that particular text. And so, they were faithful. I mean, there are differences, and the differences consist chiefly in all of these extra things that developed over time. The addition of the vowel letters, the addition of the vowel points, the addition of the accents and stuff like that. Those aren't there in the silver scroll. What's there is the consonants, but it's the same as what we have today. So that preservation going on, along with that mandate, and that's why that mandate is important to remember. God commanded that these words be learned, read, memorized, taught from one generation to the next.
I don't know if this would be outside the scope of your talk, but it seems to relate on like the apologetics side here. Like one of the things that I've heard in relation to kind of like language, dating of language and writing and all this, and other things that are going on would be like Epic of Gilgamesh. Like there's always constantly people saying like, oh, this thing predates like this Christian or Jewish tradition or myth or whatever, blah blah blah. But anyway, so like Epic of Gilgamesh would be like one that I've heard where they're saying the Epic of Gilgamesh was written before, has the flood story, and it's written before the Hebrew stuff, or any of this, or any of the things from here with like the Greek and the Hebrew. Is there anything that you can talk to about that? Does that relate to this?
The Epic of Gilgamesh is something that's found in several different periods to a greater or lesser degree of completion. And one of the principal tablets of the Epic of Gilgamesh dates from a time after that of King David. So there is this, I think it's the 7th tablet in the Epic of Gilgamesh that dates from a later period like this. Now, it's true. We don't have manuscripts from Moses. We don't have manuscripts from the temple at the time of King David or Josiah or from the time of Zedekiah. We don't have manuscripts from the time of Daniel. We have manuscripts from slightly after the time of Ezra, Nehemiah, and Daniel. And we have in those manuscripts the record of the requirement of the law to preserve the text faithfully. Now, historical critical scholars will look at that and they'll say, well, obviously this was made up so that they could exert authority over the people when they came back into the land and establish their own priesthood and a new kingdom. And so they gathered all these texts together and they edited this and they made this story about such and such. Well, one of the difficulties in maintaining that argument is that when you look in Genesis and you look at, and just to give an example, I'll give you a couple of examples. First is spelling errors, okay? So in ancient Hebrew, there's a name like this, and in Greek, it comes out like this. How do you get from that to that? Esobon to Thesobon? Well, if you remember those letters, ancient Hebrew, you've got this as the and this as the t. So, reading through this, it's easy to see how somebody could have, slopped together those two marks to get this, so it looked like a T instead of like an A, an aleph, and a tav. So this is an example. There are a few of these things. A scholar named Shemar Yahu Talmon collected 89 different examples of this kind of thing that took place in the Pentateuch and in some of the earlier books, as an example of saying, well, look, we might not have ancient Paleo-Hebrew manuscripts, but we do have plenty of evidence to show that there were transcriptions of these things between the Hebrew and the Greek that show us that, yeah, it was transcribed in this alphabet, dating from what we know archaeologically, or what we think we know archaeologically, from these ancient times. So there's one type of evidence. The other type of evidence is that these people are assuming that the biblical text was put together at the time of at the time of the return from the exile, Ezra, Nehemiah, and such. Okay, Esther's a little bit later. And so what they're claiming is that these priests and these royal families got together and they put this Yahwistic source and this priestly source and this Elohistic source based on the names of God that are found in the Pentateuch. That they wove these together to try to unify the people and to establish a religion by which they could dominate or rule the area and such, whatever political aspect of it they want. Problem is, when you read in Genesis, the names that are found in Genesis at the time periods that we understand from the biblical chronology are the same types of ethnic names that you would find, and you do find, in the cuneiform tablets from the Assyrian Empire and the Babylonian Empire. It used to be argued that Abraham, he couldn't have existed. That name wasn't used there. Isaac, nobody would have said Isaac in those times. We've got clay tablets from 1850 BC down to 1350 BC with names Abraham and Isaac. Not the same guys, but the same kinds of names. So the argument against the Bible saying it must have been written later, it's not reasonable to assume that somebody in 430 BC, after coming through the Babylonians and the Medes, is going to know enough to say, we better be careful to make the right choices on the kinds of names we give these people if we're going to put them back in the period of time that these people used to live in. Do you understand that? Now, a second part of this is there are covenants in Genesis that God makes with Abraham and with the people around him. Now, would you write a letter? How do you start out? What's on the outside in the envelope?
Address. Who's it to?
Yep, you've got who's it to, you've got your return address, and you've got the stamp and stuff like that. You open it up on the inside, let's say it's a formal letter. What are you going to put on there?
Dear Pastor Abrahamson.
You might even have a heading that says who it's from first, right? Yeah. You might have your watermark or whatever it is in there. And then you're going to have an introduction, and you're going to have the body, and then you're going to have a thanks or a sign off, and then you're going to have your name and a signature. And maybe address information at the bottom too, depending on how but there are formats that you use for writing a letter. Now, if you're writing to a friend, are you going to follow that same format? No, you're not. Okay, if you were to look back through 100 years just of English letter writing, the form of English letter writing is going to differ from region to region and time to time. And so it's possible when you're looking at the letters of Shakespeare to figure out, hey, you know, this fits with this time or this doesn't. And so when people make these forgeries, they have to get like N pieces of books that are actually made in the time of Shakespeare to get the paper that dates, and they have to learn the format of writing, and they have to get the letter forms right for that area and the structure of the letters right to try to pass them off at Sotheby's to make money off their forgery. Well, when Abraham has a covenant with God, it follows a certain format of introduction, testimony, fulfillment, and promise, or, you know, these kinds of elements and witnesses. It turns out that you can look at the time of Abraham, and you can look at the time of Isaac, and you can look down to the time of Moses, and you can look down to the time of Joshua, and you can see that these are different structures for the way these contracts, these covenants, are made. What's interesting about this is that when you look into the ancient Near Eastern literature in the cuneiform, is that you'll find that the covenant format that is used in Abraham's time matches with the covenant formats used in the ancient Near East in Mesopotamia also at that time. And it would be, I think, beyond reasonable to imagine that somebody in 430 BC, after they're coming back from the exile, to say, you know, we better get the covenant forms right from the Hittites and the people surrounding Abraham. So we got to look these up and make sure we have how their letters were signed and stuff, and the format of the letters correct when we put together all these different sources to make the book of Genesis. You know, so this is one of those things where looking at the cuneiform information as data and saying, here's how they wrote their stuff, here's how they structured their stuff, helps us to see how in Genesis actually does reflect the time period that Genesis is talking about, according to maybe the best information that we have about the time period from the secular sources. That doesn't mean that we're right that these are exactly correspondent date-wise, but they're right in the ballpark of what Genesis actually claims about itself. That address the issue? Okay. Well, thank you all very much. I greatly appreciate your coming today. This has been a reshoot of what we had intended to shoot back in June after the Synod Convention for the Apology Conference that we had at that time. So again, thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Now I must sign out.
Thank you for coming and doing this again.
Was it so bad, Inga? Yeah.
What do you see ahead, Joe, in the future with the changes in language nowadays and the electronic input and everything?
I think that a lot of what's going on as far as like the languages and stuff is very dangerous digitally. I think a lot of our dependence upon digital technology, it can be so very useful to find stuff and to research and to put together when, you know, you got the whole Bible and there's the Ancient Near Eastern Text Project and stuff like that, and it makes looking at things and making honest comparisons much easier. But so many people are leaving their things in the digital medium and not bringing them over to physical medium, that it just disappears. It's like a memory hole in George Orwell's 1984. The stuff that, if you've ever done research on the internet from the time that the internet was invented, not by Al Gore, but from the time that the internet was invented, when they started hooking up networks together to exchange information, places that host information have changed and disappeared. Back in 1992, one of the main ways that you would get information and papers from a place was a type of information service called Gopher. Nobody knows what Gopher is anymore. There was FidoNet before there was the big internet, and you know, the web was invented, I think, by a Swedish guy, and I think in 1992 is when the first, you know, web server went up and such. And a lot has changed, and some of these web resources that we have, like the pictures of Codex Sinaiticus that I had, were from the Codex Sinaiticus website, Well, web browsers have changed enough so that that website sometimes is inoperable. You have to use an older web browser to actually use the website because there's no funding to keep it up, you know. And so as technology changes like this, these things get lost. So that's what I think is a danger of digital technology. Pardon?
To say nothing of the corruption.
It can be corruption as well. And that's, I also, any of you have Logos or Hermeneutica for Bible software? Anybody buy Bible software?
Use BibleWorks.
BibleWorks, yeah.
Which, there you go, they're going out of business. So.
They are, yeah, that's the Hermeneutica thing. Yeah, they are going out of business. It was wonderful. I mean, I talked to the guy when he was first developing it back in '92, I think it was, you know, and it was based on the ideas of something called gram chord back then, you know, which I don't think anybody knows about anymore. Wonderful resource, and you know, you have to pay for your upgrades, and you have to buy a computer that can run the latest operating system. You pay for that, and you pay over and over and over like that. I don't have it with me. I've got a couple of books in my library, and it gets more and more expensive every year. One book that I bought is called Cultic Calendars of the Ancient Near East. It's $150 for one book. The book is about 500 pages. And I can take that book and I can set it down and, oh, it still works. You know, and here, can I have your phone and show you the difference between that? So if I take this and I go like this, with the book versus the phone, what I mean by that is, yeah, a physical book is going to cost quite a bit to get it first. And when you get like Hermeneutica or any of these other software, you get these wonderful packages to do a lot of good research. But you are investing in something that you're going to be continually investing in and re-upping over and over to buy permission to get to that library again and again and again and again, as long as the businesses stay in existence. I have books from businesses that haven't existed for almost 200 years, and the books are still there. That's why I like the physical media much better than the digital. Not that I love the digital media, and I think it's very useful, but it is transitory. You know, it's difficult that way.
I suppose not even just the text, but like any notes that you're taking on them as well.
That's right. Yeah. You won't be able to upgrade anymore after this last upgrade for your Bible software. And that's it. You know, you've got the note-keeping component for it too, right? Yeah. So those notes, and it's not going to be upgraded to match the next Windows operating system. So if Windows changes the library to do this little widget in this thing, then that's it. No more usefulness. It's gone. You got to keep an old machine that's capable of running the older version of Windows so that you can run your version of BibleWorks. They hope to do that by emulation, but none of the emulators are that good.
One thing I was just going to ask you about, though, in context with the writing, do you do quite a bit of handwriting of Hebrew or Greek or these other scripts just to get because it's sort of
yes,
like how do you get the feel for what it was like to write this all the time and get it intuitively, unless you do it. But I'm just curious how, if you do quite a bit of it.
I don't know if I would ever say that I would do it intuitively. I do quite a bit of transcription on this. I didn't bring along anything as an example of, well, actually, yeah, I do. Okay, so this and some of the slides that I showed you, those are my drawings.
Oh, so you replicated the inscriptions.
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah, I do the inscriptions. Yeah. And when I'm going through a Hebrew text and there's an issue of understanding, whether it might be a text critical issue or a question historically or stuff like that, I'll write the text out in old Hebrew script without spaces to see if that makes a difference in how somebody would possibly read it. That might explain why there's confusion between this and the Syriac or this and the Septuagint and such. And very often that does clear things up very quickly. Well, thanks, guys.
Thank you.
He used to practice doing that when he first started college, and he'd send letters home practicing this,
Oh, okay.
the way the letters look and stuff.
My
like
son
Yeah,
that.
great.
I'm good to cut, right?
Yeah, oh yeah.